Computer. All righty. Thanks for being here with us again, Dr. Anderson. We're going to get started right away because we had such a phenomenal response to your last Working Through It Wednesday with us, in specific with pitfalls to functional behavior assessments that can be found on our YouTube channel. But we are so glad to be back with you and now talking about behavior intervention plans and any ideas that you can offer on that. Just a reminder to everyone as we get started, Dr. Anderson is the Senior Vice President of the Applied Behavioral Analysis for the May Institute. She holds a joint appointment as Director of May's Institute National Autism Center, and she oversees clinical services at the May Institute and promotes research and dissemination of evidence-based practices through the National Autism Center. She is well-versed in her areas of study, and we are so thankful that she is here with us to share a little bit more in part 2 about the behavior interventions plan specifically. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to the wonderful Dr. Anderson. Thank you.
That was such a nice introduction. Thank you so much. And it's funny to say great to be back since I'm really still in the exact same place I was last time, but I guess it's great to be back virtually. And I'm excited to get to talk about behavior support plans, which is really one of my favorite topics. Without further ado, I think I need to share my screen. Let's try that. All right. Hopefully y'all can see a big PowerPoint slide. Is that true?
That is true. We are good.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to jump right in. And so I thought that obviously I can't do any sort of justice to talking about how you develop a behavior intervention plan in any sort of depth or anything today. So I guess you might think of this more as just some handy tips for people that are pretty fluent in behavior intervention planning. Hopefully somebody will get something out of it, or maybe some guidelines to start thinking more about behavior intervention plans for people who are less fluent. So one of the things that I like to talk a little bit about first is why we do a behavior intervention plan in the first place. And the reason somebody should do a functional behavior, why we do an FBA. And so the reason why we do a functional behavior assessment should be to develop a function-informed intervention. That is an intervention that's based on the results of the functional behavior assessment. Unfortunately, we know that all too often that link between the functional behavior assessment and the BIP gets missed. In fact, recent interviews and surveys of educators have shown that up to about 80% of behavior intervention plans in schools have no link to a functional behavior assessment. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I think that one of them is that we don't focus enough on how to make that link and how to do it in a way that's feasible for teachers. You know, teachers have an incredibly difficult job. They're charged not just with the academic instruction of a whole lot of students, but also we expect teachers to really facilitate their social and social-emotional development as well. We expect them to do that for a lot of different students who come from markedly different backgrounds with markedly different experiences and expectations. And that's a tremendous thing to ask. And so then we throw on top of that a behavior intervention plan. And if the BIP isn't really informed by the context of the classroom, the teacher's skills, the teacher's abilities, the teacher's values, and so forth, it's not going to work. And I think we don't spend enough time talking to people about those parts. You might call them the soft skills of a behavior intervention plan. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but I think that that's a real key piece to developing a good BIP. So a good behavior intervention plan identifies the intervention practices, and the practices are really the who's going to do what, when they're going to do it, and why they're going to do it. But it also identifies the systems, and systems are the broader contextual things that need to be in place, like who's going to provide training. If a teacher is out of the classroom or an aide is out of the classroom for training, who's covering his classroom? When is training going to happen? Basically, it's who's going to do what, when, why, and how. Who's going to support those things so that they can happen. And then the last piece that a good behavior intervention plan needs to talk about is the monitoring plan. And monitoring is, what are you monitoring? How are those data going to be collected? Who's going to collect them? How often are you going to look at the data? And what decisions are you going to make? And all too often I have found that for BIPs, we focus here, we focus on the practices, and the systems to support a teacher in implementing the BIP get ignored, as does the monitoring. And again, because I don't have time to go into all of that today, we're not going to go into those sorts of things in any depth. People that are interested in more on any of this subject can certainly reach out to me. We have a lot of resources and supports, including training in all of these areas. But my focus today, I really wanted to talk explicitly about how you can link the BIP to a functional behavior assessment, and just give a couple of examples of that. So again, this is not obviously an in-depth kind of thing, but just some examples that we might think about. So when somebody is doing something that annoys you, so let's step out of the school context for a second and think about when a friend is, not a friend, but maybe your child or your dog or your cat is doing something that annoys you. Like, let's say that your dog jumps up when you leave you home. Our first response, we want that behavior to stop. And our first response is to go here. We like to think, well, what can I do after that behavior happens so that that dog, that cat, that person, they don't want to do it anymore. And that's where we go a lot in general. It's why parents yell at their kids. It's why we yank on our dog's collar. It's why we give our partner the silent treatment, and so on and so forth. And we do those same things with students in school. We want to be reactive. When a problem happens, we react to it. And so oftentimes when people are developing BIPs, this is really where they focus too. But let's be real. How often does that stuff actually work? And by work, I mean, it doesn't make you feel better because you yelled at somebody. I mean, by work, that it makes the problem less likely to happen in the future. And I'm going to argue that not so much does it work. You yank on your dog's collar when she jumps, but she's still going to jump the next time, the next time, and the next time, and the next time. It's not working. Even if it stops that behavior in the minute, it's not working in the long run. So instead of starting there, what I actually encourage people to do when they're thinking about behavior support planning is to think about what you can do to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. And the way that we do that is that we start here. So this is a behavior chain. I'm not sure what happened to my shape here. The problem behavior, what did fit, but now it doesn't. So now we have problem behavior. That's pretty good. But we're going to focus here. So you've got these antecedent variables that might lead to problem behavior, and then the consequence. The trigger is a easy way to talk about what is behavior analysts. We call it discriminative stimulus, and a setting event is a thing that makes the consequence more effective. We'll talk about all those things in a minute. But the important thing to the take-home point is it's much easier to prevent a problem from happening than it is to deal with it once it's already occurred. So that's where I like to start with behavior intervention planning. So what we want to do is really think about what can we do to prevent the behavior, and next, what can you do to teach and reinforce. And I'm going to give you some other examples of strategies for here. And I apologize for my slides. They looked really good until I uploaded them to be able to present them with you today. And so I don't quite know what's happened to some of them, but I'm kind of mortified. So anyway.
It happens. It's part of the setting in the event and all the noises that are happening outside at my place too. So I really appreciate what you're sharing, and I understand what's happening with it. I'm using your words in a broader context, but I appreciate it.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back. Don't worry, I'm going to give you a few examples of prevention, but I want to just walk through the overall layout of a good behavior intervention plan. The next piece of behavior intervention planning is thinking about reinforcing desired behavior. So let's talk about for a second, let's say that you've got a student who, when it's time to do independent math work, she just kind of passively refuses. And if the teacher calls her out and says, hey, come on, get to work, get your book out, she might sigh, and then the more that she's pushed, that behavior escalates until maybe she throws her book, or she yells, or she creates other disruptive behavior. Now, what the teacher wants is for the student to complete that independent work, And the payoff should be maybe feeling good about herself, getting better grades, learning the content, so on and so forth. But the problem is that that desired behavior of doing independent work and completing an entire assignment is so far removed from where she is now, which is she's not even getting her book out. That's a huge, huge leap. And it's really unlikely that you're going to get from doing no work to doing an entire assignment independently without some help in between. And so the help in between, oh my gosh, so embarrassed, is what we call, what that should say is replacement behavior. The replacement behavior, the way I like to think about replacement behaviors is that they are really the baby steps. A replacement behavior is really a baby step. It's what gets you from where you are now, which is problem behavior or passively ignoring and doing no work, up to doing an entire assignment, but we have to get there slowly. And so we're going to walk through what all of that means in just a moment. So I thought, though, when we walk through how you do this, I'm going to share a couple of examples with you, but the take-home point for today, I think, is that the function of the behavior matters when you're thinking about prevention, when you're thinking about teaching, and when you're thinking about reinforcing. So just as a refresher, function is the reason a behavior is happening. So maybe a student is putting her head down on her desk or swearing at the teacher or throwing things, and the function is to avoid engaging in that academic task. Or it might be to obtain peer attention, or to avoid peer attention, or obtain teacher attention. The function is whatever it is that is reinforcing that problem behavior. And we want to keep our eye on that function throughout the entire design of the intervention plan. So I'm going to walk through that a little bit, and I thought we would start by thinking about a student who engages in a problem behavior. Let's just say it's maintained by obtaining attention from others, and we'll talk a little bit about obtaining peer attention, obtaining teacher attention. There's lots of different types of attention and attention from different people. We're just going to kind of walk through a few examples. So, as I've alluded to, behavior intervention plans are generally multi-component. There's a prevention component. There's a component of what behavior you want to see more of that you're going to teach and reinforce. And then there's a component of what you do after the problem behavior to make it less likely. Now, a behavior intervention plan does not have to include all of these components, and oftentimes they don't. Some behavior intervention plans include all of these components. Others might have just one component, and that's okay. You want to think about what's the biggest bang that you can get for your buck. And so in a school, I like to think about what are the things that a teacher is going to be able to do feasibly that are going to have the biggest effect. Those are where we really want to start. So prevention, as I said a few minutes ago, this great picture of a classroom here that's kind of in chaos. Prevention is all about doing what you can to modify the antecedents, the things that seem to make that behavior happen. And there's two different ways that you can do that. One is to think about what we call a motivating operation, and that's a fancy way of saying, what is it that makes let's say it's teacher attention. What is it that makes teacher attention more reinforcing? Or what is it that makes peer attention more reinforcing? So for a lot of kids, it might be that they haven't gotten any attention for a while. The teacher's had her attention diverted to other kids. The other kids have been getting the attention, or kids have been engaged in independent work for 3 hours and there's been no peer interaction. Well, one thing that you might be able to do is just increase access to non-contingent attention. And so there are ways that you can do that. For example, well, I'll use an example with my own son. He engaged in really just kind of passive, he was just sort of shut down when work was difficult. And it wasn't clear to us if that was really occurring because he the work was hard and challenging and he wasn't sure how to do it, or if he really wanted the teacher to come and help him, mostly for her attention. I think it was more of the latter, but what we ended up doing was increasing this kind of non-contingent attention. And the way that we did that is that we taught Evan, the teacher would come over and she'd say, okay, so everybody's going to do their work, and Evan, I need you to work on this assignment. And she would draw a line at first below just the first problem and say, I want you to work up until this line. When you get to the line, raise your hand. I'm going to come over and check it. And then she would gradually move the line down the page. And she would say, look, if you have any questions, you don't understand something, just skip the problem and keep going. But when you get to this line, I want you to stop and raise your hand. Even if you don't have any questions, raise your hand and I'm going to come over and I'll go over your work with you. And so what we were doing, you can see, is two things. One is we increased the amount of attention that he got, just non-contingently, if you will. And we also gave him an opportunity to get help. So you might do things like that. If you have a student whose behavior is really motivated, reinforced by peer attention, maybe you can do group work before the activity when problem behavior happens. Another thing that you can think about is just rearranging the environment to remove triggers. So if, for example, being seated, maybe this child, his behavior is really triggered by being seated next to, let's say, the girl in the back who's got her hand up. If that's true, maybe you just change his seating environment so that that trigger is no longer there. That's something else that you could do. And the third possible prevention strategy is something that's called an abolishing operation. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I'm not going to tell you what that is yet. Some of you might know already, but I'm going to come back to that and talk about that in just a second.
I'm very curious about what that is, but thank you for just reminding us about the natural opportunities to increase and decrease the amount of attention and things that happen in prevention and within the classroom. Sometimes it's just what's naturally happening, and including what's happening within the teacher and the setting, like you mentioned in the beginning, is probably one of the first places to start.
Yeah, I always like to think about what we can do to prevent a problem. And there's a principal in Oregon who I worked with for a long time, and he used to do great examples of this. There was a group of kids that he used to call his high flyers, the ones he would see in the office a lot. And after he'd been there for about 1.5 years, the teachers were all in an uproar, because what he was doing is he would page the teachers just in the middle of the day and say, excuse me, Mr. Johnson, but I need to see Brian in my office. And they'd be like, well, what the heck? Brian's actually not doing anything, man. But he would do that almost every day, and then he faded back a little bit. But he said, you know what? I'm going to see these kids now, or I'm going to see them later, and I'd rather see them when they're being good. And so he set up this really great system where he would call these kids down when they were behaving well. He would give them special things to do, like helping them with assignments and things, pulling them out of class that he knew was difficult before they had problems. And it was amazing to watch him. And he finally explained his logic to the teachers, and they got it. Excuse me, but my dog is having an issue. I'm so sorry. This is the joy of working from home. So again, it's really about thinking creatively about, you're going to pay it now. You're going to do something with that student. You're going to have to put the effort in one way or the other. You can do it after the behavior, but that's no fun, and it's disrupting all the other kids, and it's hard for us, and it's emotionally challenging. Or you can do it at the front end, and I would rather do it at the front end. So I like to always think about that I'm going to do it now or later. So I thought, if it's okay, I just share a couple examples of some prevention strategies for problem behavior that is maintained by attention, and just share a few of these with you. So the routine, let me just remind you that when you do a functional behavior assessment, you always want to think about the context or the routine that the problem behavior happens. And so we talked about, last time I was with you, doing a routines analysis where you identify, maybe it's doing independent work or during less structured times like recess or the playground, the routine when that behavior happens. Once you know the routine, one thing you can do, and I talked about this a few minutes ago, is what we call front load attention. So if a student is likely to engage in disruptive behavior that is maintained by peer attention during group work, maybe you can figure out some activities that the student can do where she gets attention ahead of time. Like maybe she can lead a 3-minute break where you play a game. That's something you could do in elementary school, for example. So you can front load attention as an example. That was more of a peer attention one, but you could do the same thing with teacher attention. During the routine, the example that I gave you with my own son is a great example of something that you could do. He may have been really wanting more teacher attention, so we set it up so that he was receiving more feedback more frequently. And one of the things that I really like about this intervention is the responsibility is on Evan. He has to raise his hand, right? All the teacher had to do was draw a line on the paper, and then she could go do her job and teach and work with all the other students instead of remembering to come back and see Evan. He would get to the line and he'd go, and I watched him. I sat in class once and watched him, and he would work, and he would circle his problems, and he was confused, and he'd get to the line, and this is when he was in first grade, and when he got to the line, every single time he went, and he looked at the teacher, and he looked back at the line, and then he raised his hand, and he watched her, and when she came over, his face just broke out in this huge smile. It was the coolest thing. So that's another easy kind of intervention that you can do. Similarly, providing extra help and checks for understanding. So a teacher might go over to a student after she's given instructions to everybody and say, okay, I just want to check in and make sure that you're clear about what we're doing. Talk to me about what you're going to do first, second, third. Just providing extra attention. Putting a seat near the front of the room. This is one that I love. A lot of times teachers put the disruptive student in the back of the room because I guess the logic is they might disturb fewer students, but I like to have the students who are giving me the most challenges near me where I can see them, and it also gives me an opportunity to make more eye contact and provide more overall attention. Peer attention, similar kind of things. You might do a group activity before independent work so that the student is getting some peer interaction before they go into that routine where problems used to happen. I love to have students lead activities. I've noticed that a lot of times when there's a student who has some problem behavior, that's the student we don't want to have lead things because it feels like we're giving them something special. But oftentimes that very act of giving the student some responsibility or something special is exactly what they need to turn things around. So it takes some work sometimes to make these kind of things happen, but sometimes it can be really positive and powerful. During a routine, changing seating. So if there are 3 kids that struggle, maybe you separate them, have them not sit near each other. You can also do more group work for kids whose behavior is really peer motivated. They might work better in a group. So these are just some ideas showing you again why thinking about antecedent strategies really needs to be linked to the function. If somebody's behavior is really maintained by avoidance, front-loading teacher attention isn't going to work. If a student's behavior is really maintained by avoiding completing instruction, group work is not going to help. Having them lead an activity beforehand is not going to help. So we really need to keep the function in mind, even when we're working on the prevention end of a behavior intervention plan. All right, I told you I'd talk about these fancy abolishing operations, and now I'm going to do it. So I'm sure that most of you have heard of setting events, and we talked a little bit about that last time. A setting event, if you think about that antecedent behavior consequence, and so your antecedent might be a request to do independent work, and then the behavior might be an escalation, and the consequence is avoiding the task because they get sent to the office. Sometimes we have a student where they do completely fine in independent work, and things are great, and they do a great job. But then every once in a while, as soon as the teacher says, all right, class, take your books out and turn to page 35, that student is off. And I bet you all know students like that. When there's a situation where a trigger is a trigger sometimes, but not all the time, or not most of the time, that's when we might want to think about a setting event. And a setting event is this thing that makes those events triggering. And when the setting event's not there, they're not. So a good example of a setting event might be getting in a fight with your mom in the morning before school, or not getting enough sleep the night before, or taking medication or not taking medication. It's something that sets this whole thing in motion. So I'm going to give you an example of a student that I worked with quite a few years ago now. So I spent a couple of years in Omaha, Nebraska, very cold place, tornadoes, very cold tornado place. So I left, but I worked with a school there, and they had this student who they were really puzzled by, and they called me in and asked if I would help them. And so I went and I met with the teacher, and I met with the whole team. And this was a fourth grade student who was a pretty good student. He was doing pretty good at school, and they'd never really had any trouble before. But this was in about end of October, and in his first period class, his first class of the day, when he was asked to really do almost anything, when his teacher directed any instruction towards him, sometimes he would just fly off the handle, and they couldn't understand why, because there were other days where he was great. Came in, he was great, he did his work, he was happy. But then on these certain days, he would come in and he would just kind of have his head down. He wouldn't do a thing. And his teacher would say, oh, let's call him Awesome. Awesome, please get going, please get started. And he was off like a trigger. He would run around the room, he would throw things, he would scream. And initially they tried just ignoring it. And that turned out not to work so well, because then he started running out of the classroom and running up and down the halls and slamming the doors to other classrooms. And you can see that this had just really escalated. And people were really stumped, because like I said, a lot of the time he was fine and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And there were all sorts of hypotheses. People thought maybe he was having a psychotic break. People thought maybe they just weren't sure what was going on. And I honestly wasn't sure either. I had no idea. And having no idea is not fun when you're called in and you're supposed to be the expert. So I was kind of thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And so what we decided to do is, his mother was participating on this team, and she was really concerned and stumped too, and she didn't understand it. And because we couldn't figure out anything that was happening at school, I asked his mother just to take notes and just to record on a piece of paper for us every morning how the morning routine went at home, and just to give it a 10 if it was perfect, if it was great, he was in a great mood, and all the way down to a 0 if it was a horrible morning. And so she kept those data and she emailed them to me. And then I had the teacher just keep track of days, super easy data. Did he get triggered, yes or no? And after about 2 weeks, we looked at those data, and lo and behold, there were some mornings where this boy was getting in a huge fight with his mom. And what they were fighting about is that the weather was getting cold. He only wanted to wear shorts. And his mom was worried about him. She was really worried that he was going to freeze. He was going to be really cold, because again, we're in Omaha. It's almost November. It's cold. And she wanted him to wear pants. And on the mornings where she insisted that he put on pants, and they had this prolonged battle, he came to school and he was in a ticked off mood. And that's when all of these things happened. So that is a really good example of a setting event. A fight with a parent in the morning triggered this whole escalation sequence. Now, that was an easy one, because we actually just convinced his mom, let's just keep a pair of pants at school. If he gets cold, he can change. Problem solved. Oftentimes, though, for us in schools, those setting events are things that we can't do anything about. We don't have control over home life. A lot of our students have bad home lives. So if a setting event is something like not getting enough sleep, or not getting breakfast, or parents fighting, or on and on and on, we often can't change those. And so that's where this thing called a neutralizing routine comes in. And this Horner Day and Day, Rob Horner is an incredible psychologist out in Oregon, and he really developed this term. And what a neutralizing routine is it's something that you do when you know that that setting event has happened. You can think about a neutralizing routine as something that you insert between that setting event and whatever the trigger is. So if you know that when a student's parents get in a fight, and you can tell that because she comes in, those kids, they come in and the hood's up, and it's going to be a bad day. Well, you could insert a neutralizing routine from when the student arrives at school and before whatever that trigger is. And a neutralizing routine is simply something that makes that setting event less powerful. So for example, I'll just give you some examples of some of the ones that I've used. So with students whose home life is really rough, and when they come in the morning and you can either tell they had a rough morning or a rough night, or sometimes these kids will just tell us. We've done things like letting a child have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes in the library if a kid likes the library. So if I've had students who love the library, we let them go to the library for a while. And you might say, well, they're not doing their work, but they weren't going to do it anyway. And I would much rather have this student in the library, calm, getting herself under control, so that after a half hour, even an hour, she is able to work and participate and learn and not disrupt the school. So that's an example of a neutralizing routine. If a student didn't get enough sleep and they're exhausted, maybe they take a 15-minute nap. A neutralizing routine is simply something that you do that makes that behavior less likely to happen. So I'm just going to show you, let's just look, I'm just going to show you an example. So these are some examples of some data. And so this is like, if you just look up here, this is clay and this is problem behavior. This is the graph I want you to look at. These black circles up at the top here that are around 30% of time the problem behavior happened. Clay is somebody who, he was a student who was in a foster care situation, and when his biological parents were supposed to come and visit, they often would cancel. When they canceled, the next day he had problems. So these are what these black circles are showing is his behavior the day after a visit was canceled. The squares down here that say neither, basically that means that the visit wasn't canceled. Everything went great. And this SD here, his trigger was being asked to do something. And so here you can see, never had problem behavior when neither happened. The black squares down here, that's when he was asked to do something. But if his parents hadn't canceled a visit, he did fine. It was only when his parents canceled a visit and he was asked to do something. The neutralizing routine for him was that he could sit with his teacher and look at a picture book of family events. And you can see that when they did that, and then went back to ask him to do things that worked great. So and then they reversed back to baseline because it was an experiment, and then put that back in. So this is just an example of the really powerful effects of neutralizing routines, which I absolutely love. And I'm going to pause here and just see if our wonderful moderator has any questions, if that's clear how a neutralizing routine works.
I love it. I'm thinking, I love the thought of neutralizing routines, and then I'm thinking of what neutralizing things can we do as students come back to the school year this year, because we're going to need some neutralizing things for our students to come back to school and be able to reestablish our sense of connection, our sense of community. And what can we do right now that could be a neutralizing routine to help our students prepare to come back? I love this. Thank you so much for sharing.
You know, for a lot of students, mindfulness is a big topic these days, and I have found that doing like deep breathing or mindfulness on the soles of your feet, those kind of things are incredible neutralizing routines. And true confessions here, I do some of that stuff myself. When I have a really bad morning and then I know I'm about to go into a meeting and it's going to be immersive, I sit in my office, I shut my door, I dim the lights, and I do like 3 minutes of deep breathing. That is a neutralizing routine. And so all you have to think about is, and sometimes you just work with your student, what are some things that you can do that help dissipate the effects of that bad morning? That's all we're doing here. So I love neutralizing routines. I could talk about them all day, but I'm not going to in the interest of time. I'm going to keep on going. So those are prevention strategies. The next part of a behavior intervention plan is teaching and reinforcing skills. And like I talked about a few minutes ago, it's super easy. I'm so embarrassed by this. It's super easy to think about what we want the student to do. So here's an example. The routine is math, double-digit problems when the student is requested to do them, especially if she has to go to the board and do them. She escalates to where she's swearing, she's pushing her work away, and they send her down the hallway or to the office to calm down, but of course she's also escaping her work. Teacher would like her just to complete her work, lots of reasons to do that. That is way too big of a jump. So again, think about baby steps. A baby step is something that we can do instead. It's a replacement behavior. And the key thing to remember about this replacement behavior is that it has to serve the same function as the problem behavior. It has to result in the same thing. So a lot of times we'll see someone where they engage in this problem behavior and they get out of the classroom, they avoid doing the work, and people try to teach deep breathing. Well, deep breathing isn't resulting in getting out of work. So it's not going to work as a replacement behavior. It's not going to work. You need to have a replacement behavior that lets the child avoid doing work. This is a hard thing to stomach for us as educators because our mission, our passion is helping students learn. And when I say something like, teach them a way to avoid doing their work, we go, oh, but you got to remember, they're not doing their work now. The first step, the baby step, is helping that student learn a more acceptable way to get out of doing work, and then we can gradually work from there. So let's walk through that a little bit. So in this example, we talked about what's going on with the student, and we want to come up with something that the student can do that serves the same function, that gets them at least to escape work. They might need to get out of the classroom. It might need to be a behavior that results in that. When you think about a good replacement behavior, there's a few really important things to think about. Like maybe it could be raising your hand and asking for a break. Maybe it's having a break card. I really like break cards, and we can talk more about that. But whatever that replacement behavior is, it has to work better than the problem behavior. If you think about problem behavior almost like a habit, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to break a habit, like you want to stop chewing your nails or playing with your hair or smoking or swearing or whatever it is. Those kind of habits, we call it a habit really because it happens without thinking about it. And the problem behavior could be like that too. Habits are hard to break, and the only way you're going to break a habit is if the behavior you want the student to do instead works better. And by working better, I mean it might be more efficient, so it might pay off more quickly. It could be easier. So all of this, having to push or work away and swear and get really mad, that takes a lot of effort. Raising my hand, that's pretty easy. So long as I get out of the classroom more quickly than I do when I swear and push and so forth, that's really good. It also might result in a bigger payoff. Maybe when I swear and push my work away, I get sent out in the hallway, but I have to come back and do all the work by myself. Maybe if I raise my hand, I still get a break, but I don't have to come back and do the work. So there's a bigger payoff. So those are just some examples, but it's super important that you think about making sure that this behavior works. This also comes back, of course, to really working with the teacher to make sure that he understands that this behavior has to work. So if you're going to teach a student to ask for a break, when the student asks for a break, they need to get a break. And it can't be sometimes, it has to be all the time. One of my favorite interventions for this kind of behavior is a break card. And there's an intervention that some colleagues and I developed a few years ago that's called Breaks Are Better. And the basic gist of it is a student gets a card. They can either have a card with little things that you X off, or you might give a student, let's say, 3 break cards. And they have 3 break cards that they can use during some period of time, like maybe the first half of the day or the whole day. They get 3 break cards, and they can use them anytime they want to. One of the really cool things that we found is that students almost never used all their break cards. They held on to them. And I thought that was really, really cool. This is an intervention that we kind of adapted from an intervention that's called the bedtime pass. The bedtime pass is the same basic idea. Kids get out of bed a lot and they're going, oh, mommy, can I have a drink? Or I'm thirsty, or I just need one more hug. Well, you give kids 3 or 2 bedtime passes and you say, I really don't want to get mad at you anymore, so I'm going to give you these passes. All you have to do if you want something is just give me this pass, and you get 2 of them, and I won't get mad at you and get what you want. And more often than not, you know what happens? Kids hold on to their passes and they wake up in the morning and they've got their passes because they've got 2 and they don't want to waste it. They want to save it in case they really need it. And we see the same thing with this Breaks Are Better intervention. So that's a good possibility also. I should mention though, and because we're not going to have time to talk a lot about antecedent interventions for escape maintained behavior, when you have a student who is engaging in some sort of problem behavior to avoid or escape a situation, the big question that you want to ask first is, what is it that makes that situation aversive? And we know it's aversive because they want to get out of it. Why is that? If it's instruction, my first question is this instruction really being provided at the student's current level of performance? If the student is reading at a second grade level and she's in third grade, that's an aversive situation. And all of the consequences, all of the contingencies on earth aren't going to help. What's going to help is addressing that antecedent by teaching her how to read, getting her skills up. So whenever you have a problem behavior that's maintained by avoidance, I really like to think about, what is it that make that consequence aversive? What is it that makes the situation aversive? So I might use this kind of intervention for a student who is struggling in math, so that when he's in math, he has ways to get out of doing things when he gets frustrated, but only if he's also getting assistance with learning, say, math facts, so that over the long term, he's developing his skills as well. I hope that makes sense to everybody. I kind of want to ask you all if that makes sense, but I guess I can't because you're not here.
It does.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So we talked a little bit about increasing desired behavior when you have, and the desired behaviors could be that replacement behavior more often than not. And when you're going to increase a desired behavior, there's really two steps. The first is teaching. And the only way that we can teach is if we, and by we, I mean the team, the teacher, everybody who's involved is really clear about exactly what the behavior is that they want to see more of and when they want to have it happen. And then you want to explicitly teach that behavior to the student. You want to teach the behavior, what the behavior looks like, what they should do, what some non-examples are, and also when they should do it. Super important steps. And then the next part to that is that each and every time that behavior happens, it needs to pay off. It needs to be reinforced, especially early on. If that behavior doesn't pay off all the time, the student's not going to do this desired behavior. They're going to go back to their problem behavior. The best way to break a habit is to reinforce the behavior you want to see more of each and every time it happens. And this is really hard to do. So this kind of gets back to the system support. What kind of support does a teacher need to be able to do this? Now, a lot of times a teacher might say, oh, well, if I allow her to take a break every time she raises her hand, she's never going to be working. And that might be true. But here's something to think about that's really cool. If you have the function right, and if you teach a student to raise her hand, if she raises her hand a lot and you never have problem behavior, that actually is awesome, because now you know that you got the function right and you've got a good replacement behavior. And now you can figure out what to do to start building in instruction. If she's got the skills, if the instruction is at her level, that's really great. Maybe you will do something like say, thanks so much for asking for a break. I'm really glad you did. I just need you to do one problem and then you can get a break. And there's lots of ways to start to increase that. Or, saying if you can take a break now, or if you do one problem, you can take a 15-minute break later. So there's lots of ways to set that up. But actually getting to the point where you have no problem behavior and the student is engaging in the alternative behavior really just confirms that your hypothesis is right, and that's awesome. And then there are lots of ways to move forward from there that are way beyond what we can talk about today, unfortunately. Another caveat here is that we sometimes think about rewards like they're this blanket thing, and a reward is a reward is a reward. Well, I am here to tell you that it is not. Reinforcers, incentives, an incentive is only going to function as a reinforcer if it's something that the student actually likes. And so the term reinforcer, probably as a lot of you know, is a really technical term, and the actual definition is it's something that is delivered after a behavior that results in the behavior being more likely to happen in the future. And so not all incentives are reinforcers. And so I really like this little comic here. So we see basketball players, and you got your coach on the sideline, and the coach says, oh, good job, Scott, nice shot, come get your sticker, you earned it. And the little caption says, although it's intended to boost the students, whoa, where'd it go? Whoa, bad things are happening here. What's happening? I don't know. Can you guys see the screens? Oh, it's only me that's bad things happening to. Okay, we're good. We just
Yes, we
lost.
can see.
There you go. And so the caption says that although it was intended to boost the team's morale, his reward system wasn't really working. And of course it wasn't. I mean, stickers are fine, but they're not going to increase my behavior. You want to think about what's going to function as a reinforcer for the student or for staff. Like when I've been in some schools where they give stickers to teachers, and that's nice and it might make people feel better, but I bet that if they really wanted to increase certain behavior, there are things that we could do, like, oh, pay them more? I don't know. Just an idea. So anyway, you want to think about, is this thing actually a reinforcer for the student? And make sure that you use incentives that the student actually wants. The last component of a good support plan is decreasing the reinforcement for a problem behavior. And again, we often like to go here first. We like to think about what's the bad thing, the aversive thing that can happen after the behavior, and how do I make it not pay off anymore? The problem is that it is super difficult to do this part well. So here's some common consequences that we like to do. I'm thinking, like, especially if we think a behavior is maintained by attention. One common recommendation that I hear given to teachers and parents is just ignore it or use extinction. And I'm here to tell you that it's almost impossible to do that. I'm a behavior analyst, and I could not ignore my son when he was crying as a young child. The whole idea of doing cry it out was not something that I could do. I just couldn't. And for teachers, when we say, just ignore Johnny when he yells, well, that's all well and good, except that what's probably going to happen if the teacher, so Johnny, she says, okay, everybody get out your books, and Johnny goes, Tuh. And if she ignores that and his Tuh is maintained by her attention, Johnny is likely to try something else to get attention, like slam his fist down or slam a book or poke a peer. And more often than not, he's going to escalate until it gets to the point where she can't ignore it. And that's a real problem. So ignoring is not something that I recommend very often. Some of these other things are sometimes better strategies. Timeout is a really hard one to do in school, but some people like it. You can, if the behavior is maintained by peer attention, we can teach peers to ignore a student's behavior, but you're going to have to teach them how to do it really explicitly. And I will often help classrooms set up a classroom incentive system where we talk about respect and social emotional learning and how we support each other. And one of the ways that we support each other is when a peer is having trouble, we don't shine a light on it. We only shine a light on behaviors that we want to see more of. And we can set up something like a marble jar where when students are ignoring, what I like to call shining a light, when students are not shining a light on another student that's struggling, the teacher might put marbles in the jar, and then when it gets to a level, they get something. So if there's an incentive for peers to ignore, that's going to work a lot better. There's a whole lot of things that you might do to minimize problem behavior. And depending on the function, some are going to be more effective than others. Deciding which strategy to try first can be difficult because there might be 3 different ones that are all viable. Like maybe you're going to try having the teacher attend more to behaviors they want to see more of. And you're going to teach, you also could teach peers to ignore. Or you could have the student take 5 minutes of quiet time. And they might all work. You want to talk to the teacher about which one he or she finds most feasible, which one seems easiest, and start there. The start there part is really important, though. I like to think about how when we're responding to a behavior that we want to see less of, there's 2 ways that you can be. You can be a brick wall, or you can be a rubber band. And most of us, frankly, we're rubber bands. If you think about if you have children at home, or a pet, or maybe just somebody who annoys you, It's so frustrating. And we respond really inconsistently. So maybe, let's say your dog barks when you're, oh, I don't know, on a web conference, and you ignore it. And then a few minutes later, she barks again, and you say, be quiet. And a few minutes later, she barks again, and you say, partner, would you please do something with that dog? And then a few minutes later, she barks again. You're like, oh my God, okay, I'm going to give her a treat to shut her up. And you throw her some treats. And then a few minutes later, she barks again. And you give her treats again. A few minutes later, she barks again. And you give her a slap on the behind. That's being a rubber band. A rubber band means that what you do is different every single time. The problem with that strategy is that it's likely that some of the things that you're doing are actually making the problem worse. They might be reinforcing it. That's one problem. And another problem with being a rubber band is that there are some people, some students who I think kind of thrive on that unpredictability and that sort of chaos. You know, the student who's like trying to see what they can do to make your face turn red. Those kind of students, that inconsistency in and of itself may be really reinforcing. So the alternative to being a rubber band is to be a brick wall. And by being a brick wall, what I mean is that you pick a strategy and you stick to it. You decide as a team how long you're going to try it. So maybe you decide you're going to try it for 10 days, 2 school weeks. We're going to stick with it, even if it seems like it's not working. We're going to stick with it for 2 weeks. So every time this student happens, I'm going to do X. And I'm going to be a brick wall. And the nice thing about a brick wall is that it's predictable. It's the same thing every time. And predictability for students is kind of boring. If a student wants to get a rise out of a teacher, that same consequence every time is really boring, and it's going to decrease the behavior. So you want to think about being a brick wall. Now, I said that ignoring is not a good strategy, and it's because the student might escalate, and it's also because it's really hard to do nothing in the face of a problem. So one of the things that I like to do instead of recommending ignoring is to talk to a teacher about responding briefly and consistently in a calm way. So it might be saying something like, every 5 minutes, please sit down. Please sit down. Please sit down. You're doing that every 5 minutes one time, or every minute, however often you want to. What I'm not doing is, please sit down. A minute passes. Please sit down. A minute passes. Sit down. A minute passes. Get in your seat. It's the tone, the statement, everything else is exactly the same. That functions in a lot of the same ways as ignoring because it's predictable and it's boring and it's consistent, but you're less likely to see an escalation because there is a response. So that sort of consistent, calm response is something that a teacher could do. If you are providing support to a teacher, you need to be really sure that the teacher feels confident and comfortable in doing that and is really ready to say that same thing every time. Another reason that I really like that strategy is that it helps the teacher be prepared for what to do. We make mistakes when we're not prepared for a situation. When I don't know what to do going in, I mean, this is true with my own son now. When I'm going to go in and have a discussion with him and I haven't prepared for what I'm going to do, if it goes badly or he says A, B, C, and D, I do things as a parent that I'm not proud of. Like I stomp out of the room or I yell or I go, you know, those like embarrassing mother moments for a behavior analyst. But if I'm prepared, I handle those situations much better. So you want to help a teacher be that brick wall, say the same thing and do the same thing every time, because being a brick wall will result in reductions in that behavior. It also lets you tell if the intervention works. So if every day for 10 days, whenever a student slams a book, the teacher says to the other kids, gosh, I really like how everybody's being really quiet right now. And she does that for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, you're going to be able to tell if that was effective or not. So that's really cool too. So when you think about consequences for problem behavior, pick one and think about being a brick wall, being consistent, testing it out for some period of time. Which brings me to the last thing that I want to talk just briefly about. And I touched on this earlier. The practices, the interventions, those are just one part of the support plan. making the support plan effective means that we put in place systems to support educators in supporting students. Those are things like making sure that the teacher has a voice in the intervention, is able to talk about what he or she is going to be able to do feasibly, that they have supports to help them learn how to do it, that they have supports to monitor it. So I will often tell teachers, you know, if you agree to try this for 10 days, here's what I agree to. I'm going to come in whenever you tell me it's convenient and good for you. I'm going to watch the students so you don't have to take data some of the time. And I'm going to watch and see what's working and not working. And then you and I will meet together and we'll talk about it. And at the end of 10 days, if it's not working, I'm going to be here to figure out something else that you can do. That's a systems level support. We want to make sure that we're providing whatever systems need to be in place, whatever resources we need to make things work. And then the last piece, I talked about this when we talked about being a brick wall, is you've got to have a system to monitor. Monitoring is the way that we tell that intervention is working. It's basically collecting data. For a lot of teachers, data is a 4-letter word. I recognize that data is a 4-letter word, but I mean the other kind of 4-letter word. And so that's because a lot of us, you know, we're scientists, we're researchers, we ask teachers to collect ridiculous amounts of data. But a teacher's job is not data collection, it's teaching. So I like to think about and help teachers develop a really feasible system so that they can give me data. And it might not be the most in-depth data, but accurate data that's not very in-depth is way better than in-depth but inaccurate data. And so we could talk a lot more about all of those sorts of things too, but I see that I am about at the end of my time. And so I'm gonna stop here for today and see if you have any questions or anything for me.
I would just love to say thank you. I learn something every time I talk to you. I love your language around the rubber band and brick wall, and the data is a 4-letter word. That's a good thing I was on mute on this side for all the noises around me, but also because I was laughing. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think it's so important to remember all of the pieces that you shared. Everything was very imperative to what we're doing and supporting our students. And thank you for sharing personal examples as well. That's always helpful to include those in. And I almost changed my setting when you said that about the setting. It made me think maybe I should do something. But just thank you again, Dr. Anderson, for sharing. And also I'd love to point out that Dr. Anderson and the May Institute are available for additional supports as well. So thinking of that, as we move forward, if your school would like to reach out to them and find different ways for different tools or consultation or things like that, they are available and they're a great resource in addition to these webinars that we've already had and that will be highlighted through the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina.
And will you just share my email address with folks so that if people would like more resources or more training, people can reach out to me and I can help facilitate that.
Absolutely. We will include it on our YouTube channel as well and tag you in the May Institute. So thank you so much for coming and being a part of all of it. Well, for joining all these virtual platforms. It's great that we're able to connect in different ways. Thank you again. And from the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina, this is Working Through Wednesdays with Dr. Anderson.